The limitation is only in my imagination. Everything else, you don't really need to travel, you don't really need to go and find a place that is already iconic or picturesque to make a beautiful images. You just need to find a place that really connects with you, and that's what I found in this forest.
Well, hey everyone. Welcome to episode 404 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen with your host, Matt Payne. In this week's engaging conversation, Francesco Carovillano shares his journey as a landscape photographer, discussing his transition from commercial work to personal projects, particularly focusing on his new book, Fontainebleau, Intimate Landscape. He reflects on the importance of finding creative freedom in photography, the influence of social media, and the lessons learned from the Barbizon painters who fought for the acceptance of landscape art. As a personal note, I found this to be one of my favorite conversations on the show, and I hope others enjoy it as much as I did. Be sure to stay tuned all the way through, as this episode is a goldmine, if you ask me. Okay, let's get to this week's episode with Francesco Carovillano. All right. Francesco Carovillano, it's great to have you back on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Matt, for having me back.
Yeah, and I apologize for my stupid American accent. I'm sure your name sounds much more eloquent in your native language, but I'm just this guy from Colorado, so I apologize.
It's okay. Don't worry at all.
Yeah, so a few things. People may recognize you. You did a podcast together about, 2 years ago now, episode 256. And also you're a regular contributor to On Landscape magazine, which I am as well. So it's great to see your writing in that magazine and great to see your face, because I don't think we had video back when we recorded 2 years ago.
No, we didn't.
Yeah. So for people who don't remember you or aren't familiar with who you are or have never heard of you before, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a full-time landscape photographer from France. I was born in Italy, but then eventually I moved to France. And about 12 years ago, I started to work as a commercial landscape photographer, mostly for national tourism boards. And then I also started to do personal projects alongside the commercial work, until the point where the commercial work started to be quite boring, and I delved even more into my personal projects. And luckily, I do these projects in a forest near my home, where I live with my wife and our 2 kids.
From reading the introduction from your book, which we're going to talk a lot about today, awesome book, by the way, that you used to basically live in the van with your family full time. Tell us a little bit about that, what that lifestyle was like.
Yeah, basically, before photography, I used to work in animation, so it was a very sedentary job. And when I fell in love with photography, especially landscape photography, I started to travel like crazy. So it was a complete shift from my previous career in animation. And yes, in order to fulfill all the assignment that I had, and also to build a better portfolio all the time, basically, I was traveling non-stop for 8 months out of the year. So first with my wife, and then with our first kid, and then the second one. So they have literally seen a lot of Europe through the camper van. And so yes, we were doing that, and we did that for 10 years. Now we only do that kind of traveling around with the camper van for 2 months out of the year, so that I can devote the rest of the time to my personal projects. When I say that, people are a bit surprised because of the amount of time that I spend doing my personal project, but that's because I build huge archives for these clients, and so they keep buying images. And then, of course, every year I still add to this archive, during these 2 months of work for them. So it's actually through these long periods of traveling that I was able to create a personal style, if we could call it like that, within the commercial landscape photography. So I started to really understand why clients used to love kind of images that they could put on the covers or on double spread or whatever. And I, through just constant work and isolation, although I was traveling with my family and stuff, I was really able to isolate myself when I was having my photography sessions, when I was photographing, I was able to create this way of making travel photography, which when I left animation was exactly what I wanted to do. But after 10 years, I realized that photography can be so much more.
Well, there you go. There's a lot we could talk about right there, but we've only got so much time. And I really wanted to talk to you about your book because there's so many fascinating topics within the book that you've written and created. I'm going to need your help because I don't totally know how to pronounce the name of the book. Fontainebleau? Is that the name of the forest?
Fontainebleau.
Okay, so I got it sort of right. So
yeah, perfect.
Fontainebleau Intimate Landscape is the name of your book. And thank you for sending me a copy. That was super generous of you. Thank you so much. And first of all, let me congratulate you on such a fantastic achievement. I think creating a book full of your personal work is kind of like the pinnacle of what a lot of photographers are trying to aspire towards. So congratulations on that.
Thank you very much.
What was the original inspiration for creating and writing the book?
There are many reasons for that, but I think the main ones are my love for this forest, and also I wanted to encapsulate or frame my evolution through photography up until that point. So basically, when I decided to restrain my commercial work to only a few months out of the year, I spent 4 years just photographing the forest for about 10 months each year. So I was really focused on this. And so I felt that I was changing as a person and as a photographer through the forest. After these 4 years, I felt that I had enough images and also enough articles to make a book. And so I decided to make this book to kind of mark the evolution along a timeline of my life with this book. And of course, I'm not finished with this forest. I plan to release more books with other aesthetics and other topics. Because this one I felt it was ready, I really wanted to make this book to mark this first 4 years, even if it was a little bit more than 4 years, because of course when I was not working for my commercial clients, I went to the forest all the time. But I say 4 years because it has been 4 years that I deliberately decided to just delve into this forest for most of the year.
Wow. I mean, that's a long time to spend in one place. And maybe for people who aren't familiar with that particular location, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit more about the place Fontainebleau?
Yeah, so the forest basically is located 60 kilometers southeast of Paris. It's very well connected to Paris. There is a train and, of course, roads and everything else. And originally, the forest was hunting reserve for the King of France. So basically from 900 until 1700, so the 16th century, basically, it was only the hunting reserve for the King of France. Nobody really could enter it. Although this is a massive forest, it's, I think in square mile is 400 square miles. So for European standards, it's a very big forest.
Right.
And so because the king was using it as a hunting reserve and nobody could, build houses or do any kind of construction there, it stayed like that until the 1600. Then it was open to the public because the King of France basically stopped going there for hunting. And that's when the painters, the French painters who worked there, started to paint there. And then eventually they protected this forest. They worked all their life to create the first artistic reserve in the world. So basically this forest has remained as it was, untouched. The only thing that changed is that, of course, through time, trees grown much more. And so, of course, it changes all the time, but it has not been destroyed by construction works.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, reading through the book, I learned actually quite a bit about you as a person. Some of the things we already talked about on our first recording back in episode 256. But one thing that struck me from reading your book is that you originally were asked to work on a commercial book project and decided instead to produce a book for yourself that was more personal. And I found that to be really fascinating. I feel like that's a very risky proposition in today's competitive and difficult photography industry where finding work is really difficult. So why did you decide to go that route?
Because I could not do something that I did not believe it being worthwhile. So for me, the Paris photography book was meaningless. Although it was a nice, very nice actually, project to be doing as a photographer, it was completely meaningless for me. Mostly because I have been doing travel photography commercially for 10 years up until that point. So after 10 years, I was trying to improve in a way or analyze my own photographic practice. And I wanted to do something much more personal, precisely because I could not care at all anymore about having my images published. It was great to keep working for a few clients, which I still do, but for the general pool of clients, let's say that, the general amount of possibilities that I could have worked for, I did not really care. The Paris book then became completely meaningless for me, and so I really started to ask myself what I really wanted to do. Also, this book would have taken me at least 5 years. So I would have need to resist this desire to do something else for 5 years. So it was a very long period of time. I really did not see myself going to Paris every day because I'm much closer to the forest than to Paris city center. So I decided to basically stop working for this project. I did this for about 6 months on and off. I was going to the forest, I was working for other clients, and then whenever I could, I would go to Paris and do this. But it was really not what I wanted to do. So I know that it's very risky, but for me, actually, the risk of losing time that I could invest in something else, it was much more riskier in my point of view.
That's awesome. Yeah. I guess what struck me was that it was kind of inspiring to me to hear kind of a personal story of somebody who was finding commercial success, but maybe not connecting on a deeper level to the work that you were taking on, and making the choice, the informed choice, to give up that commercial success and pursue something that felt more personally meaningful. I feel like, especially in landscape photography these days, that's relatively rare. I mean, or maybe I'm just naive, but I feel like a lot of people, they reach a point where they realize in order to sustain a lifestyle of doing landscape photography full time, they kind of just resign themselves to the idea that they have to do some things that they might not like to do, like create a YouTube channel that teaches things that maybe they're not that excited about, or maybe teach workshops or things like that. So to me, I felt like that was a really powerful statement that you made for other photographers to say no to things that maybe are more a guaranteed success, and to do something that's risky but more personally fulfilling.
I think it came also because when I was working as a travel photographer full time, traveling in a camper van, as we said, I was doing that extremely intensely. And by that, I mean that, as I said, I was doing it 8 months out of the year, sometimes even 9. And, I was photographing before sunrise until sunset. It was a lot of work because before I used to go on one of these long trips. I used to plan the whole trip. So basically, I was spending 3 weeks in front of the screen just planning. I was even planning the place where to park the camper van and the playgrounds for my kids. So right. Everything was planned. Every day was planned. I know what I was going to photograph. I knew the highlights. For example, we spent a lot of time in Spain, in Portugal, in Ireland, in Germany, in Italy. And I knew the highlights of every places where I would have visited and photographed. But of course, then I needed to explore the place for myself, so everything was kind of planned, although I had time to do original work, because that's what the client wanted, of course. Otherwise, he would have just bought the images somewhere else. So everything was extremely intense, to the point that when I went back home, I had 4 months to edit 8 months of shooting. And of course, I had to wake up at 5 in the morning just to edit the images, because then in February, I needed to get back in the camper van and keep traveling until the end of November. So it was very, very intense. Then for some clients, I also took part in some advertisement campaign. Those were very stressful months, because, well, just the nature of the projects. When you deal with a marketing agency, they don't really know what they want. So they hope that you come up with something, although they give you a briefing and whatnot. But it's very stressful. You have to deliver images every 2 or 3 days, usually, so they can check and they can, adjust what you are doing or whatever. So I kind of reached the point where I did that. I was, and I still am, very happy with what I managed to do in the world of travel photography, especially from a European point of view, because of course I always practiced photography from France. So I really started to understand that I wanted to go deep instead of going left and right, and I didn't want to spend time and mental energy planning trips or driving around or all these things. Although, of course, it was magnificent, and it still is when we keep traveling. But I really wanted to focus on my own creativity. I really wanted to try to develop a personal voice through images. And so this is why it was very easy for me to reject also other kind of commitments and don't waste time doing other things such as YouTube or other kind of things, because I knew what I wanted, because I did photography so intensely for 10 years that I knew exactly what I wanted. Actually, my problem was trying to find a way to don't let down anybody and still be able to do what I wanted, basically. So I completely understand that it is very difficult, but I have to say that I could have not envisioned this 2 or 3 years before I reached that point of saturation.
Makes sense. Totally. It kind of reminds me of like influencers, right? Like they're,
Exactly.
they get like millions and millions of followers on Instagram, and then like they get into this vicious cycle where they're constantly having to produce content for other people. And then what I find is that it just by like reading their captions and like seeing how they behave, like they start rationalizing everything. Like, oh yeah, I'm never home, and like I'm doing like a lot of stuff that's kind of cringy, but man, look at this awesome lifestyle I have. I get to travel full time, and I think it's easy to get stuck in that kind of cycle of doing things that maybe you didn't want to do to begin with in order to kind of like meet this fantasy idea of what your lifestyle should be. And I don't know, like, I'm not saying that's what you did, but it kind of reminds me of that a little bit.
Yeah, but and I completely agree with you. I'm not on social media at all. I've never been, but I met an influencer, an Instagram photographer. That's how he presented to me. And the funny thing is that he was working on the same campaign I was working on, which was very interesting because he was only working for the Instagram part of this campaign, which I didn't even know existed. So basically, they gave him the same list they gave me. But the difference is that I had the entire year to do it. I could go there and photograph it, all this list of places whenever I wanted. He only had 15 days, and there were basically 16 places. So he didn't really have the time. And every day he had to post a post, on social media,
yeah,
exactly, about what he was doing, what he was photographing, and whatever. And he was very stressed, and he didn't like it at all, because the sad part is that when he showed me through his phone some images he made for himself. And so I said, this is so much better than the stuff you do commercially. Why don't you put this on Instagram? And he said, I cannot, because if I do so, I will lose my audience. And that's the problem of having an audience that is not capable of following you in a way. And that's why also I'm not on social media, because I don't care to develop such things. I think there are people that are very fortunate that they have a big audience, but this audience really loves them and understand that an artist goes through periods of evolutions. So they understand the changes. But the vast majority of people that consume social media, they are used to, these kind of things. They label a lot people, and they want to get the same things. That's exactly what he explained to me, basically, which was very sad, to the point that one day he went to do a job for the Japanese tourism office, and they just saw the number of followers, and they wanted a guy who had a lot of followers in France. So they called him and they gave him a bunch of money, and they paid him a trip to Japan for a few days, and that was it. So he was very sad to tell me about all this. It is what it is, and it's.
I'm not here to judge. I mean, if that's how you want to make money, that's good for you.
I don't think he had a choice, because you start with the dream of doing photography full time. You find a way to do it. You don't really know how this way of doing it will turn out in like 10 years, 5 years, or whatever, because things evolves in different ways you can't really predict. So he wasn't really, he didn't know, like most of us, me too, for example. I had no idea that the clients that I started to be involved with, I would keep working with them for all this time, for 12 years now. It's unpredictable. Sometimes I think it's the kind of work you do. I think it's very important. I tried also always to produce new work, always better, of course, but in a way that I was trying to follow my own evolution. And luckily, they kind of accepted this, because I think they needed this kind of evolution through the landscape. Also trying to understand that trends changes, but if you create a personal way, that personal way can evolve in different ways. It doesn't have to follow the trends, especially if you didn't, how can I say this? If you didn't to get used to other trends, because your work was slightly above, or it arrived slightly before, so that, I'm talking about creating big collection for clients in the tourism business, basically. If they have great images of the places they market, they don't need to look somewhere else, because those images works. But to understand why those images work, you need to put in the work, you need to put in the years of experience, and you need to also, see your images published by different magazines and stuff, so that you can understand, so they bought these images and they use these images in this way, in this other way, and you can try to push this further little by little without being sunk by the amount of other images that there are out there.
For sure. Well, we could talk about that for like 6 years, but I want to talk more about.
I know. I'm sorry.
The book. You're good. So you kind of started to talk a little bit about this, but in the book, you talk about going deep as opposed to wide as it relates to locations or subjects. And your past involved a lot of assignment commercial work across the globe, and that was for others. It wasn't for yourself. What have you learned or gained by going deep into one specific location that was near and dear to you?
I learned that the limitation is only in my imagination. Everything else, you don't really need to travel. You don't really need to go and find a place that is already iconic or picturesque to make a beautiful images. You just need to find a place that really connects with you. And that's what I found in this forest. And just spend time in this place. Even if I do the same hike a few days apart, I will always find something different. That's exactly what I did today as well. I went there. I knew the hike that I was going to do, but I saw very incredible things that I didn't expect this morning because of the weather situation. So for me it was very important after all this traveling to find a place near my home. Luckily I had it, and I didn't even know at first, because for a certain time I thought of moving elsewhere, like changing continent or country. But then I really discovered this forest, so it was very important for me to find it, because I really found myself in it. And then I realized that the potential of this forest, although you have no iconic places, is unlimited. precisely because it has no iconic places, no huge vistas, no grand landscape, no beautiful mountains. Everything is slightly hilly, and at times you have some gorge, some little canyons, but because they are in Europe, they are not that deep and they are quite wide, but they call it gorge, like canyons, but they are not really canyons. So the geography is very varied, but I really understand that through time I could understand the place and try to interpret it in my personal way. And when this started to work, I could not go anywhere else to photograph because I had found my own playground.
You said that you literally found yourself. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I have the feeling that I really needed to discover this place because it gives me a lot of peace and calm, and it's a place where I feel free to experiment through photography, which I never felt it before. You know, all those places I photographed before, I never really felt free. Someone might say, yes, that's because you were working for a client and you needed to photograph what they wanted. That's true. But because I was traveling in a camper van, I didn't really have a schedule. I was making my own schedule. So I could keep, free days, and I could decide I want to stay in this place for longer. And I did many times. But I never felt that freedom, and I never felt that I had so much potential to express, interpret through photography in a place. I could feel that, I can stay here 2 or 3 days more, but then it will not be necessary anymore to stay here. In this forest, I really feel that I can stay there for forever, basically. And not only because it's very big, but also because I don't know, it's like I feel very free to create and experiment, and I never cease to find new opportunity to photograph. Yeah, I don't know how else to explain this. I also have a feeling that sometimes I am pulled in some areas of the forest. Like I'm walking and I feel like kind of a voice in a way, an instinct very strongly that tells me, maybe you should visit this area and stay there and look there for longer. You will find something. It's very, because there is a lot of silence and I'm alone, for some reason it's like I'm more in touch with my own self. And that's probably it.
That makes sense. And going a little bit deeper, you said that you've been able to express yourself through this forest and through the photographs that you've captured there. What are you expressing?
I'm expressing my own sensibility. And that's very important for me, actually. This is something that I discovered through this forest that was very important for me to express what attracts me in a precise way and spend a lot of time crafting these images, not only through composition, but also in the editing phase. Although my images are not very retouched, as you have seen from the book, I don't think they come across as very edited images, but I still like to play with them, to make small adjustments. Of course, most of the things I like to do is to be there. This is why also today I was there, and I really feel this attraction to this place and to express my own sensibility through image making. I think that's the best way I could describe it, yes.
Well, I feel like it definitely comes through. I mean, there's sections of the book where I continually found myself going, wow, that's beautiful, beautiful photography. And I think because of the fact that I don't want to say it's a mundane subject, because it's not, but it's not, it's like it's a forest, right? Like it's like you picture a forest from a childhood book, like when you're growing up with, butterflies and trees and rocks, like this is that forest. And as you know, forests are very chaotic and they can be very difficult to photograph, but you've done it in a way that distills different scenes down into like a more pure essence of the forest, little slices of it. I mean, that's almost literally the definition of the intimate landscape, right? So I think you were successful in that regard. Taking it a step further, it seemed to me, going through the images in the book and reading the essays in the book, that the overarching focus is to help readers learn lessons about nature and art from the master painters from the past who originally fought to make this forest in France a protected location. And I only know this because of your book, but these painters were known as the Barbizon painters. Is that how you pronounce it? Yep.
Yeah.
So what do you hope readers glean from your focus on these master painters from the past?
Their intense artistry and struggle as well to make sure that landscape painting would be accepted as a major theme in the Academy of Fine Art. Because at the time they painted in this forest between 1830 and 1875. In order to be accepted, a landscape painting, in order to be accepted in the Academy of Fine Art in France, it had to be used only as a decor around biblical, mythological, or historical figures. So basically it had to be created from scratch by imagination, basically, most of the time. Or if it was inspired by a true location, it had to be always with these figures to depict a biblical scene or a mythological scene or a historical scene. What they did was to get away from this philosophy and this conception of landscape painting as far as possible. So they left Paris and they literally hid in the forest of Fontainebleau, where they started to paint to start this fight, which is the same fight that the Impressionists, so the generation after the painters of Barbizon, picked up and kept on fighting and eventually won at the end of the 19th century. So what I would like people to understand is that they really believed in what they were doing and they really put everything on the line. I mean, literally. One of these painters, Jean-François Millet, he had 8 kids. And he was living in Barbizon, which is a tiny village 60 kilometers southeast of Paris, as I said before, which was completely rural. But this guy was painting constantly, and he was a major, major influence of Van Gogh. Van Gogh literally copied in his own style 21 paintings of Jean-François Millet. So these people really believed in what they were doing, and they did it all their life without really ceasing to believe in it and without trying to find quick commercial solutions. Because they could have just stayed in Paris and earn a nice living doing to the medium class or probably even to richer people. I don't know. But for sure they could do that. And they rejected that altogether and they went in the forest and they stayed there for most of their life. It's a very interesting history of art which is explained in the book, and that I think is a massive inspiration for me as well. The fact that they isolated themselves and they tried to create their own voice through the forest, through landscape painting, to the point of creating this term, intimate landscape, just to refer of the fact that they wanted to paint the pure landscape, without figures from history or mythology or whatever. It's incredible. Of course, for us now it's normal, but at that time it wasn't.
Right. I mean, now like plein air painters, it's like a pretty common approach to landscape painting. And if you think about traditional landscape photography, it kind of follows in that same vein of trying to reproduce the beauty of the landscape that you're inspired as the photographer, as the artist. And it's interesting, as you're talking, I'm thinking about all of these reactionary moments in history in different art forms, painting, photography, where there's all these similar parallels. And it seems like what inevitably happens is that there are institutions that create these dogmatic kind of like, this is what it means to be a painter, or this is what it means to be a photographer. And if you deviate from that, then that's not art, or you're like not accepted or you're rejected. And then it goes like, it's almost like a pendulum. Like we saw it in photography, right? Like we went from like the people that were smearing oils and stuff on their lenses because the photography needed to not look real so that it be accepted as art.
Yeah, they needed to be closer to painting.
Right, they wanted
crazy.
it to be. They wanted
For
it
us
to be
now, it's crazy. Yeah, but before street photography, that's exactly what happened, and that's, absolutely. And in the forest, also the pioneer of photography photographed there, Gustave Legret, Eugene Cuvier, but also Louis Daguerre, which is the inventor of the first photographic tool, we could call it like that. He basically created this machine, which he called the daguerreotype, after him, basically, after his name. And he was a painter. So he left painting to invent this photographic tool. And then he went in the forest as well, in the forest of Fontainebleau. And he went there because his friends, his painters' friends, were there. So he joined them. So in Fontainebleau, there were this big community of painters and photographers. And the photographers worked very, very hard to make sure that photography will enter the sphere of art without letting it be restrained in the sphere of industry, commerce, or science. So we owe a huge debt to these people, because they were already doing what then became known as straight photography. They were not doing pictorialism at all. But their problem was of a different nature. Their problem was that at that time, so we are talking about 1849, 1850, that decade. As soon as they started to photograph the forest, they realized that the photographic plaque was not able to render the forest as they were seeing it. We have the same problem now with our own photographic tools, But of course, for them was much worse in the sense that their pictures were extremely dark. So they started to work together, again with Louis Daguerre, to make sure that the chemical were making images more sensible to the light. They started to study ways of making images more bright in a way. And so they all worked together to influence and advance photography. Then after this period in France, the evolution of photography was taken over by the British photographers, but that's another story. So during that decade, they worked together with the painters, and the only thing that they had in common was their avant-garde understanding of what a landscape images could be. So for them, it was not important if you were using the brush or the camera. It's the philosophy that they were applying to depicting the landscape, basically. They all had this in common. So they were, working with a landscape that was taken from reality, because they were not adding things or moving things around, but they were using their own sensibility in order to make unique work, which is the same way Impressionists then worked. Sometimes they were working side by side, like Paul Cézanne and Camille Pissarro. They worked 20 years side by side, literally, but they never worried about imitation or not being original enough, because for them, they wanted to infuse their art with their own sensibility. So it was not important if you are depicting the same scene for them, because the final render of the scene will always be different. That's what they said.
So as you were talking, it struck me that it's an interesting grapple that we have in the arts, defining, you were talking about interpretation and sensibility, and depicting the forest without adding these mythical and biblical creatures, but actually depicting it in the way that you can actually witness it as someone who were to visit that location. It seems to me that you find it important that we go beyond just kind of capturing what's in front of us with the camera. And I find that in modern times, there's kind of this interesting debate between photography as a tool to document quote unquote reality, which is a whole other ball of wax and very problematic, versus interpreting what we see with the camera. And I recently read an article in Elements magazine And a photographer in there said that, quote unquote, the more I try to represent the world, the less I feel free to express as an artistic point of view. And he goes on to say that a witness is not an artist. And so when I go through your book, first of all, like every single photograph in your book is a piece of art.
Thank you very much.
It's of a place that actually exists. You've already said that you haven't added or removed objects. It's, you selected slices of the landscape, probably with a telephoto lens at perfect moments of light. You were probably drawn to those due to your sensibilities as a human being, your experiences as a photographer, your experiences as a father, your experiences as a husband. Everything that makes you is wrapped up in what you're drawn to and attracted to, and how you're interpreting the scene in front of you with the camera.
That's right.
But you're doing it in a way that is both artistic and a slice of what you could actually see as an experience through the camera. So like, what's the difference between capturing something realistically versus artistically if you're not adding anything or changing anything? Because I think there's this idea in photography land right now that if I don't edit the photograph in some drastic way, then it's too documentary in nature and it's not art. So I want to hear you talk about that.
No, I
Sorry,
don't.
that was long-winded, man.
No, it was great. No, I don't think that you need to edit an image in a very dramatic way. I think you can enhance certain things, and I certainly did that. For example, it's very difficult to find a scene in a forest, or specifically in that forest, where the shadows are quite dark, while at the same time you have the highlights that are high but not blown out. So of course, there is a degree of control where I adjust my raw files to reach that coherence in light. And as you said, I have to wait specific moment of lighting. So for example, one trick that I use, which I have not discovered anything at all, so probably trick is not the right word, but I try to wait for moments where the sun and the clouds are passing over. Where the clouds are passing over the sun. So just moments before either a cloud is covering the sun or is exiting the sun, so that I can control, I can kind of control that light. Of course, it doesn't happen all the time. Most of the time I'm actually forced to do the photo with what I have, because I know by now that working in a forest, if I go back to the same place over and over again, the place is going to be different. It's not going to be exactly the same as the first time. Never. So probably the next day, but then it's different. And the other thing which is very powerful in my experience is my own response to the place. Now, this is very interesting. There is a picture in that book, now I don't remember which page, which is the vegetation is green. I shot that in April. And when I shot that, I thought, oh my God, I have to go back there in October in fall colors. And then I went, and I did the same. I photographed the same scene, but in a completely different way. I completely shifted the composition to the left because the vegetation was different. The amount of leaves on the trees was completely different, and I didn't have the ferns so high because it was not summer anymore. So it was not about to be summer, in April. So they were much lower. So I could see a lot more of the boulders that were kind of hidden by the ferns. I could only see the tips of these boulders. So I framed it in a completely different way. I didn't even recall that I wanted to photograph the same picture with in a different season, simply because my instinctive reaction to this scene was completely different, and I couldn't care less about what I did months before. So every time it's like that. So it's very interesting what you said, because no, I don't think we have to edit images in a very dramatic way. But in order to make something unique, we need to be able to hear ourselves and try to understand that the most important thing is to ask ourselves the right questions. What do I like about this scene? Why I stopped here? And why I feel attraction to this scene? And how could I communicate this scene, this attraction that I have for this scene, to someone else that is not here? And what if another photographer would be here, just close to me? Would he take the same images? Of course not. He will feel compelled to make another images, probably behind, or even the same scene, but in a different way. As you said, I use a telephoto lens. Actually, the whole book, to be honest, has been shot with the same camera and the same lens. When I started to delve into this forest, I completely changed my photographic kit. So I have a kit that I use for commercial work with tilt shift lens and a zoom lens. So there are 3 lenses in total, which is a very old camera by now. It's the Nikon D800. I know you had it as well, because last time we did the podcast, you told me, yeah, that was my second camera. So I completely changed that, and I'm using another camera now with this zoom lens, and I did all the book and actually all my personal projects, because Fontainebleau, this forest of Fontainebleau is one of my personal projects. I plan to make more and make other books about other personal projects as well that I'm working on. So all my personal projects are done with the same camera and the same lens, because that's how I feel to select the scene that I see. And this is how I want to illustrate my sensibility and my feelings. After all this time photographing, I know what I want, and I knew that I wanted to zoom in a little bit closer, and I knew what I wanted from my camera. So that's why I changed the kit. It's really about my own perception of how I can improve my own understanding of landscape photography. And that's why also the book exists, to showcase in a way to myself and to others my own evolution up until this point of what a landscape photography image can be in a forest. So I don't know if I replied to your question. I think I went a little bit everywhere with this.
That's okay, because I have more questions that are going to get even deeper into the issue. But before I ask them, what lens?
Okay, I'm gonna just say it's a Canon R5. This is the camera, of course, and the lens is a 100-500.
Oh, it's an awesome lens. Yeah,
it's a great lens, but I don't feel compelled in having the sky in my images.
Sure, totally. No, I'm with you.
Yeah, simply because I really wanted to show the interior of the forest. I was not interested in showing the exterior, and also because these kind of images, I did a ton of I did an infinite number of images with the sky and classical ground landscape for my clients. So here I really wanted to go deep inside my own creativity, but also deep inside the forest. So a good way to match these two things for me, it was just to do intimate landscape.
Wow, it's like you knew what my next question was going to be. All right, well, we'll jump back into that quagmire in a minute. I want to talk more about the intimate landscape. So I learned a lot by reading your book about the origin of the idea of the intimate landscape. I think it's funny because a lot of people out there think it's like some kind of fad, like, oh, everyone's shooting the intimate landscape now. And I think it's funny. Well, you'll see why I think it's funny here in a minute. But the idea, I think most people can attribute the intimate landscape to the photographer Elliot Porter from his 1979 exhibition for his book with the same title. However, your book talks about how the Barbizon painters created this concept of the intimate landscape all the way back in the 1830s. And I'm curious, from your perspective, why should photographers even care about the origin of this idea?
Because if they see the artwork those painters did, they would understand what they meant. It's, of course, their interpretation of what an intimate landscape was. And of course, you need to understand the historical context. As I said, landscape images were not recognized, and they had these figures in it, and they wanted to focus on the pure landscape. So for them, the pure landscape became then the intimate landscape when they started to describe the work of Théodore Rousseau, which is basically one of the main Barbizon painters. And yeah, they had sky in the images sometimes, other times not. But that's not really the point. The point for them was not if they had to include the sky or not. It was to create an image that would depict only the interior of the forest, only the forest, and that would match their own sensibility, their own response to the place. without having to add a historical context or a biblical context to it. So it's actually remarkable what they did, because they were inspired by British painters like Turner, Lawrence, and also by other French painters 2 centuries before, such as Nicolas Poussin or Les Nain brothers. But they had to include these figures when they were in France. So that's funny, because Nicolas Poussin, for example, he left France at a certain point. He was very famous. He was working for the King of France, and he rejected all these offers from the King of France. Imagine that. And he left, and he went to Rome. He went to Italy just to pursue his own art. And there, he did not include anymore these figures. And those are the paintings from Nicolas Poussin that are most renowned today and appreciated today. So 400 years after he painted them. Because everything he did in France, he had to include these mythological figures or the king or whatever, you know. So it's very interesting how the school of Barbizon, the painters of Barbizon, that then created this movement of art called the school of Barbizon, which is the generation before the Impressionist, they took these parts of advancement that Nicolas Poussin was doing and their own life around it, basically. They decided that, okay, so we are going to do what he did in Rome, but we're going to do it here in France, in the forest of Fontainebleau. And that's it. So I think it's important to see to have an idea of the artistic side of it, but also about the kind of temperament these kind of people had. You know, they knew what they wanted, because they thought about it a lot, really, really a lot of time. And I think it's very important also to make a book or a long-term project or whatever, to know what you want. And so if you study other people's life, you get to understand their kind of choices. And it can help you greatly to make your own choices. This is why I said in the book that the word intimate landscape was invented by these painters, because I spend my evenings studying the history of art. Otherwise, I would have never known all these things. You know, when I started to understand that there were all this history of art that happened in this forest, I was photographing. There is also museums there about these painters. I started to buy books like crazy and studying all these things, because I wanted to, you know, create like a continuum to their work and my work. Of course, through my own experience as a photographer, as you said, and through modern photography, but to try to push the concept of landscape photography and intimate photography in this forest, just like they did. So I think it's important to learn all this, because it will help also to push your own understanding of intimate landscape.
As you were talking about Poussin rejecting the King of France to go do his own thing, that sounds a lot like what you did.
Yeah, the story is actually fascinating, but I don't know if we have the time to go into that.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, because as you were talking, you mentioned that kind of this school of painting, the intimate landscape, was kind of born out of a intellectual or stylistic rejection of what kind of everyone considered to be the mainstream of including all these mythical figures and that type of painting, and shifting to that style was kind of like their pushback against that. Like, no, there's more to landscape painting than that. Here, let me show you.
Yeah.
And as I think about why people think intimate landscapes and landscape photography has become a fad, I think there's a lot of parallels there, because if you think about the period of time between 2000 to 2016, there was a huge push of kind of like really, really in your face, bombastic, fantastical, big grand landscapes with epic clouds and lightning bolts and huge foreground elements. I mean, you think about like Mark Adamus and Ryan Dyer and, you know, a lot of those photographic artists that everyone started to emulate over and over and over again. And like that became what was kind of mainstream in landscape photography. And I think what we're seeing is that this kind of push back against that is intimate landscapes. Like, people are saying, no, look, there's more to landscape photography than these epic, crazy scenes that have become so popularized. And I think there's a lot of parallels between the two movements.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think people at a certain point, they started to push the boundaries of what landscape photography could be. And it's funny because it happened many times through history, not only for photography, but also for painting, and also, the movement of street photography. They basically did the same things, not only about landscape images, but in general. And it's interesting to study history and see that at times it kind of repeats itself.
Right.
But through different mediums and in different places in the world. Yeah, it's very, very interesting, and it feels really like there is a generation that creates art, and then the fascination of this art is broken by the next generation. Until you don't break the cycle of this fascination, which happens with the coming of the next generation, people are stuck into this cycle of fascination, and they believe this is great, this is beautiful. It's like they lose the ability to look in other ways until the next generation comes along and propose something new. Of course, they will not find acceptance. They will not be understood at first. They will need to struggle. But then their struggle eventually has the ability to win over the public. Of course, now I think with the internet is easier because the reach of an artwork can be huge on the internet or in many other ways. Before, of course, it was a real struggle, and you really had to wait that the following generation reach the end of their life almost, so that people will be able to break this cycle of old fascination basically and start anew.
Well, and now because of the internet, like you're saying, I think these cycles are going to happen much more rapidly. I mean, instead of 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we're talking like 5 years at a time, boom, push back. So it's interesting, and I think having the historical knowledge helps you not only understand kind of how these cycles happen and why they happen, but also, more importantly, it helps you hone in on the type of artist that you want to be, as opposed to what everyone says you should be.
Yeah, it kind of relaxes you as well, because you see other people have struggled so much, and you have seen some of them succeeded, some of them did not succeed, and so you realize that you just have to do what you want. You cannot please everyone, and you don't have to worry about that. You just have to worry about how can you push your own understanding of your own sensibility and your art. I think this is massively important, because in the end, you have so many artists in the history of art. What we remember today are those that were really, really focused in their own development. They were not trying to emulate anyone else. And so when you understand this, it kind of relaxes your own approach to art making, I believe.
Yeah, I totally agree. And let's dive back into the kind of more juicy debate side of this whole thing. The timing of your book coincided with me receiving a copy of Guy Tal's latest book called Be Extraordinary. You've seen it yet, but this is what it looks like. And it's interesting because there's a lot of contrast and overlap of the ideas within his book and within your book. On page 27 of Guy's book, he uses an Edgar Allan Poe quote to put forward the idea that landscape photography that realistically represents the landscape isn't art. And in your book, you make the case that it's the voice of the artist and their interpretation of the landscape that matters in art as it relates to photography. Since it seems obvious to me that your photographs very much are realistic renderings of the place that you love, what does this approach to creating art look like for you? And maybe put in other words, can you elaborate on what the actual difference is between being a geographer and a photographer?
It's the interpretation. I think the geographer doesn't have to interpret the scene. He just has to record the scene. Just by the fact that I select a part of the forest and I try to craft an image only around this part of the forest, I think that comes from my own interpretation. So without interpretation, that I would just be recording the forest with no attention about what it may communicate outside of its real aesthetic look, about what else it could communicate outside of its own look. And I will not be paying attention about the light or the weather or the atmosphere or the colors or the lines or the composition or whatever. So for me, it is totally true that I depict scenes that really exist, but it's also true that I try also to choose not only the light and the composition, but also, as I said before, the moment of time, the season, the amount of foliage, many things. So I don't think you need to add or delete anything. You just have to follow your own sensibility, as I said. But I also wanted to ask you, what are the differences you see from Guy Tal's quote of Edgar Allan Poe and what I wrote more specifically?
Well, I'll just say this. I haven't finished reading the book yet. I wanted to get through yours first since I knew this interview was coming. But I think your book is much more a photography book and his is much more a philosophy book, if anything else. I mean, the text is much thicker. But I think the main difference that I find is that the way that you present the argument or your case allows for the reader to be able to understand how it's possible to photograph a landscape in a way that doesn't add or detract from the landscape or accentuate it to a certain degree, like you're warping mountains or you're adding in flowers from Argentina into your photograph from Alaska or whatever you're doing with your photograph. You don't have to make those types of modifications to the final image in order for it to still be an artistic interpretation of a real place, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think there's this, I actually wrote a whole essay about this for our upcoming Natural Landscape Photography Awards book for Volume 4. And I think there's a real belief out there in photography land that you have to edit a photograph to a certain degree or else it isn't art. And I think there's a pretty big Venn diagram where you can have edited photos and fairly pure, quote unquote, pure photos and art. And I would also argue that there's photos that have been heavily edited that probably aren't very artistic, and there's photos that are not edited at all. They're not artistic too. And so I think what I liked about your book is that it provides a framework for it's about how you're putting yourself into the photograph. That's what's important from an artistic perspective.
Yeah, also because, I selected the places, the scenes that spoke to me. But I believe that Guy Tal does pretty much the same, because I read the other books from him, not this latest one, and I know his philosophy, and actually his philosophy influenced me as well, because it is very powerful. And he spent many years studying art and philosophy, and it's beautiful. And I believe that he's probably trying to say that kind of the same things, that it's not really about adding or deleting things from the image, but it's adding or deleting from your own sensibility, starting from your own feelings, from your own response to the place. And so then you delete or add within the framing or within the use of light and other basics photographic tools. I also studied his post-processing book. I don't know if that's still around or not.
I haven't seen that one.
It's older than his essays book, but yeah, he of course promotes photo editing in a good way, not too much, not too little. I mean, when it's necessary, in order to convey better your own message of the image, your own emotions. And that's exactly what I've been trying to do also from the book. But I'm very pleased that it comes across as very little editing went through the images. It is true, there is not massive amount of it, but some images took me a long time to get it right. simply
course.
because of the white balance, to be honest.
For sure.
You know,
I totally get it.
yeah. So it's very good what you are saying, and you are actually one of many people that told me this. You know, the book is on sale in bookstores around Paris and around the forest and stuff. This is also why I made this book, because I mean I knew it was not only going to sell on my website, but I had interest from other kinds of outlets and stuff in the area. And when I present the book, people ask me things like, wow, it's incredible. It feels like you didn't even retouch the images. Because they are not photographers, I don't enter the conversation with them that, no, actually there is post-processing. Right. But it's very good that you do not see this, because I was not trying to make the red super red or whatever. I was trying to recreate what I saw, because the hardest thing for me when I photograph in a forest, especially in this forest, is to recreate exactly what I saw. Because our eyes are connected to our brain, which is capable of balancing all kinds of lights. So as I was saying before, sometimes I had push the lights on the shadows, because otherwise they would be too dark. Sure. Or on the contrary, these kind of things. But and sometimes I have to do it quite selective with the brush and
of course,
these kind of things.
I mean, cameras aren't like, the technology is not there
exactly.
Yet, right?
And that's part of the process, and that's all the fun. So I probably, I don't know. I believe that he was trying to say probably the same things, because to be honest, I don't see anything added or deleted in guys' images. They to me, they feel sure. Very, very realistic, very natural, and you can tell he really follows his own heart, and he put it in each of his images. That's why he's so great.
Oh, for sure. I just feel like the way he worded, if it's helpful, I can actually read that little passage. I think it's just the way it comes across. Because you just said, I want to edit my photographs to make them look like what I remembered seeing. You just said that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's literally what you just said. And I think there's a lot of nature photographers, like myself included, who try to do the same thing.
I see the same in your images, in fact, yes.
I try to. Don't always hit the mark. But I would argue that the way he comes across, not to make this about Guy Tell, but the way he comes across is that style of photography is more documentary in nature, because you're recording what you literally saw.
Oh, I see, yeah.
He says, Edgar Allan Poe ventured his own definition. He wrote, "Were I called on to define very briefly the term art, I should call it the reproduction of what the senses perceive in nature through the veil of the soul. The mere imitation, however accurate, of what is in nature entitles no man to the sacred name of artist." And then he goes on to say, Poe's definition may rattle some who consider themselves photographic artists, but choose to restrict themselves to strict realism. And so that's what I'm trying to say is your photographs, they seem pretty real to me. And so and that's where I think this is an interesting conversation, because there's just a lot of people out there that have this belief system that if you don't alter a photograph to a high degree, then it's not art, because you're just recording what you saw. And that's why I like your book, because you're making a case to say, well, actually, the way that I composed the photo, the way that I framed the photo, the way that I arranged elements, the things that I included and excluded from the frame, composition, that is my artistic interpretation of what I discovered, and therefore it is my art. And I'm also not saying that adding and removing a bunch of stuff and adding skies and changing skies and adding foregrounds and adding flowers, that still can be art. I'm not saying it's not. I'm not saying it's an invalid form of photography. It is. I just think that I would like to disavow this notion that you have to edit a photograph to a certain degree or else it's not art. That's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah. I completely agree with you. I don't agree about that at all. But I think that probably now that you read the full quote from the book, is probably talking about not really about adding or deleting elements from the scene, but editing it in a way that although you photograph a real place that really exists and you did not alter the place as it is, you are editing it in a way that is very personal to you, so that your own interpretation of the scene does not stop at the shooting moment, at the capture moment, but it is extended in the post-processing.
Sure.
Through whatever you want to use. It can be also going crazy, which is not at all the style of Gaital or other people, but it can also be about subtle things or less visible things. But to be honest, it's exactly what I did as well. But I aimed to create a body of work where when you see the image, you can see yourself in the image. So you don't say, I will never be able to recreate this kind of nature in a picture because it's overworked, it's over-edited. Or it added graphic elements that were not in there, like an elephant or whatever,
Yeah, I would say
because now with AI you can.
I mean, the word I would use for that is it's very approachable, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. I wanted that. And to be honest, this is something I also learned through my travel images. That's very difficult. In my experience, that's very difficult. To make an image that everybody can relate to it and say, yes, I could have seen this and I could have photographed it in this way, although it's not true at all. But to give this illusion, it's very difficult because you are not creating something that is out of this world. You are just putting yourself into the world and creating something that it's you, it's unique, but other people can understand that, can see that, and can relate to it. If it's too perfect or too over-edited, people will react in a way that they will not be able to see themselves in it. So I'm not saying that I did a great job. I'm just saying that in my own experience, that is actually very difficult to do, and to edit in your own way, but not to go to over it. And so I'm actually very happy, that we are talking about this because it's very interesting. And I have to be honest, I did not know about this trend of people believing that you have to go, very much in depth in the editing to make picture art.
well, yeah, I mean, I think it's all driven by human heuristics, which are mental shortcuts. Like people think, oh, if I take a picture and I edit it enough, then I'm an artist. And I think, I mostly agree with the types of things Gaitel says. Like he's trying to encourage people to understand that, like, we can all be artists. It doesn't require you to be like this special person or to do something really miraculously special with your photographs. But I think that social media specifically has kind of hijacked that over the last 10 years, where people see kind of these plasticky, perfected landscape photographs that are obviously like very eye-catching, and they're in the popular page, and all the accounts are like from people who have 200,000 plus followers, and like they're very viral, but a lot of those images are like super refined and perfected, and I think similarly to like what the intimate landscape photographs of the Barbizon movement did in the 1830s, what we're seeing now in the 2020s is a pushback against that. Like, it's okay to have imperfections in your photographs. It's okay if maybe there's a couple of blown highlights, or maybe the mountain didn't have the perfect light, you know what I mean? Like, it's okay to have some of those flaws in your photographs, because that's nature. That's what you actually encounter when you're out there. And so the role of the photographer as artist is to then, instead of imposing their will upon that scene and changing it and manipulating it and make it look the way they want it to look, it's interpreting it in a way that comes from their personal sensibilities of understanding how to leverage the light that's there, understanding how to use different lines and shapes and compositional elements to make that photographic scene interesting in a way that only that person can. And there's a big difference between those two approaches of photography. And I'm not saying one is right or wrong.
Yeah. But I was also thinking that, when you start photography, you kind of want to make images that scream. And then the more you go on, the more you want to make images that whisper to you. And that you can listen better because it's not a scream, it's a whisper. So they are calling you. There is this quote from this French philosopher. He said that art is not about to call, but it's to recall. And then he also said something else. He said that there are two kinds of art. The art that takes the spectator from the known to the unknown to the known. And then the other that takes the spectator from the known to the unknown. And it does not take him back to the known. Now, he's basically criticizing commercial art. Because if you think about it, commercial art takes you from the known, it takes you to the unknown, so a different composition, and then you go back to the known, to something that you know, because you understand. Oh, okay, yeah, this is just an advertisement for a car or whatever. It's a nice picture, so it's the unknown, because it takes you to see something that you didn't know existed, that picture, that advertisement. But then you go back to what you know, because you understand. Oh, yeah, it's advertisement for a car. And he said that true art is when it takes you from the known to the unknown, and you stay there. You stay in the unknown, and you keep thinking about it, because you don't know. You don't know, it can be many things. You don't know what it is, because it's abstract, for example, or you don't know in the sense that you don't know how it is made, you don't know where it is made, you don't know just how to relate to this feeling, which I think is very true. I aspire to that, to be honest, to create something that would elevate people to stay in the unknown and to be willing to stay in that unknown without trying to, they can relate to it so that they can stay in that unknown without trying to put them away from it and go back to the known and say that's an image too edited, or that's this on that. I've seen that, I've known that, I know that. You see what I mean? To stay in that place where it's unknown, but you can relate to it and you feel kind of compelled to keep looking at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I have never really thought about it that way before, especially as it relates to more literal landscapes like Grand Scenic, where you have recognizable geographical objects, mountains, streams, lakes, rivers, forests, where you could literally put it into Google Lens and it'll tell you, oh, that's this lake in France, right? Like it will tell you that. And so and I think that's where intimate landscape sometimes can have an advantage over the grand landscape, because it removes some of those geographical points of reference that make it harder to stay in that unknown spot, and you're studying it and you're more interested in how did he find that set of trees, and it's you're not like, oh my god, I need to go to that vantage point tomorrow because that's an amazing scene, right?
Yeah, it becomes very, very personal, and this is also why I love to keep photographing in this forest, and I never stopped once I started, because I could feel that, yeah, this is mine. Not only because honestly there are no photographers in this place basically at all, but not because of that, because I could really feel that I can very much express myself through it. I don't have anything iconic, and I can really create the visual language of this forest on my own. I mean, it is my own visual language of the forest. When I was photographing, or I am photographing for clients and stuff, I have to respect not only their own language for the concept they want to promote, but also I'm going in places that are very much iconic. So I can put together in the framing things that have never been put together, and that's basically my job, to be honest, to see things that have never been seen together before. But still, it's not really my own place. I can craft one or two images that are different, but I will never be able to create a whole vocabulary of how to depict, illustrate, and communicate and express and interpret this natural area. And that's why it's so important for me to keep doing this personal project, because at the point where I am now, I cannot stop. I know I will never stop because it's stronger than me. Today I photograph things that for me are incredible. I could not go away from it, it was just amazing. And every time it's like that, because it's a place that has no iconic places, and I can really do basically what I want, and I can really craft this vocabulary, as I was saying.
Yeah, and I want to make a quick clarification on what I just said about the grand landscape, because I think it's very possible to create that known to unknown feeling in a grand landscape using things like fascinating geological processes, or maybe there's an interesting set of flowers that are unusual. Like, I think there's ways to do that for the viewer, but I think it's a lot harder to pull off than it is in the intimate landscape. That's basically all I was trying to say, is that it's a higher bar.
But I think there are people that are more attracted to those kind of things, and they spend more time in doing that, and they master it, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of my colleagues and really good friends, Wayne Suggs, is a perfect example of that. I mean, his photography is almost 100% grand landscape, and it's unique and interesting and tells stories, and it takes you to that unknown place and makes you sit with it. So I think it's absolutely possible. It's just not easy. Not to say that intimate landscape is easy, but I think it's more approachable from that perspective. I don't know. We could probably talk about that for 10 years, but I want to move us on to another little subject, because in your book, you talked a little bit about art and conservation. And you'd mentioned earlier that the Barbizon painters were the first in the modern world to use their art to protect a place from industrialization. And their entire artwork became a mechanism for preserving the Fontainebleau. How has that tradition carried on in photography?
I don't know how those guys pulled that off, but basically they were even against the creation of hiking trails. Just hiking trails. They didn't not want that. I don't know now what's the situation, to be honest. I know by experience that when I presented my book to local administrations, they were happy to have it. They were surprised, happy. I mean, positive replies. But I felt, I always felt that, to be honest, that no one else is devoting his life to this forest as those painters did. I am the only one. What's funny, I'm not even French, I'm Italian. But I don't care. They don't care, and this is a merit, to be honest, to them. But I'm just saying that I have no idea about that. I know that there is a big association that cares for the forest and stuff, but photographically speaking or artistically speaking, I don't know what's happening. I have a feeling that at times people kind of use this to their own advantage. For example, the little village of Barbizon now is a bit bigger than 2 centuries ago. And there is this road, basically, which is exactly where these painters were living, because there are still their studios there. And now, basically, there are these studios of these painters, and all around you have galleries of art. But the art they show has nothing to do with landscape. It's like, any kind of art. Any kind of art. So there are a few painters, but they don't really paint the forest. They have a few paintings from the forest, but very, very few, like 1 or 2. They exhibit 1 or 2, and that's it. If I were them, I would only paint the forest like crazy. Well, I'm doing this for photography, so you understand that. But it's like taking kind of advantage of the fact that there are a lot of tourists that, they go there because there is this big history of art that happened there. I don't know about conservation. It's also true, though, that you don't really need to do much conservation for this forest here, because it's already very well protected thanks to these painters.
What about other places that you're familiar with in France or Italy, for example, where photographers have been able to use their photography to protect a place? I mean, here in the United States, there's quite a few examples of it dating all the way back. I mean, Ansel Adams was part of a huge movement to use his photography, and like Elliot Porter, for example, and a few other photographers, Hyde, I believe, their photography was used to preserve parts of like the canyons in Utah, stuff like that. Dombrowski is a good example of Tasmania, where he used his photography to preserve a river there. So are there other examples of that from where you're from?
Not that I know of, but I think it's also my fault in the sense that I'm very, very isolated in what I do. So probably there is things going around. It's just me that I don't really, I'm very, very focused in the sense that I'm very, very isolated and by choice.
Well, maybe that can be a homework assignment.
Yes.
All right. Well, my last question, who do you recommend for the podcast?
So I have 3 names for you. I wrote them down, otherwise I would have probably forgot. Jonathan Critchley, Maurizio Rellini, and Luigi Vaccarella. So the first one is he does art photography, basically fine art, and the other 2, they are very much into the travel photography business.
Perfect. Yeah, I actually ran into Jonathan Critchley at this remote little cottage in southern France this year. Actually, I think we introduced each other, but I don't think he knew who I was. But I'd recognized his name because I think Rachel Talabart recommended him on her episode. So he does some really cool stuff.
Where were you in France?
In the Camargue.
Ah,
yeah. Well, actually, I started in Paris. I did a workshop for 10 days in Paris, and then I went to southern France. It was a long couple of weeks. I'll just say that.
Okay, so the workshop lasts a couple of weeks. Okay.
2 different workshops. I think they were both 9 days.
Ah, okay. Wow. So you photograph Paris. So
I did.
Now that you know that I left that opportunity to do that book about the city, what do you think? Now that you know what I did instead of the Paris book, what do you think?
I mean,
you can say that I'm crazy.
No, I don't think you're crazy. See, I'm weird because if you plop me anywhere in the world with my camera and lenses, I'll be happy. Like I'll find something that I like. Like I had a really good time in Paris. Like I don't consider myself a street photographer, but I absolutely loved the street photography opportunities there. And I don't typically enjoy photographing urban environments, but Paris is so organized and neat and structured, and the way the city is designed is very,
Wow.
I don't know, like...
Go on, it's very interesting. No, please do.
Compared to most cities in the United States, it's just way different. Like, the food is different. It's the train system is really incredible. The way that the city itself is designed, like if you ever like zoom out on a map and look at how it's laid out, it's actually pretty genius. And if you look at the city, like the way that it's designed from, I think, back in like the mid-1800s, the height of all the buildings is very similar. Like the architecture is very similar. So like there's a lot of design aesthetics about Paris that I found very fascinating because you don't have stuff that old here, in the United States. It's all,
no, that's true. Yeah.
It's like suburbia and like everything looks cookie cutter here, but like in France it's old and it just feels old, and I like that.
Yeah. And the city was completely transformed in the 19th century because of this urbanist houseman, and this is why you have all these long roads and so that really structured the city.
Right.
Yeah, no, it's all true what you said, but I don't know, for me it was really the idea of having to photograph a city, which to me it is messy and chaotic and sometimes can be complicated to get around, although as you said the train systems works very, very well, but it's the fact to be stuck into a city for many years, and I didn't want to do that. So but I completely understand that if I say this to people, many people will believe I'm completely crazy.
Well, I mean, I live in a city of 20,000 people on purpose. Like, I don't like big cities all that much. So
yeah, me too. Even less.
I totally can appreciate not wanting to spend a lot of time in Paris. And I think if someone were to ask me, hey, do you want to spend 3 months or whatever to make a bunch of photographs in Paris? I'd be like, okay, I think I could do that.
Yeah, 3 months, but 5 years, yeah. But
5 years would be hard. 5 years would be hard.
I did also other projects in Paris for long times in the past as well. So, but it's very interesting to hear your perspective about that. And if you ever come to Paris, let me know. Maybe we can meet there.
Sounds good. What an episode. I love it when these conversations force me to question my thinking about this art form. Thank you to Francesco for the awesome conversation. Be sure to check out our bonus episode on Patreon, where we discuss the not so obvious benefits of being ignorant of locations before photographing them, a key tenet to both of our approaches to making photographs. Please support the podcast on Patreon to gain access to that bonus episode, as well as over 240 other bonus episodes. Just go to patreon.com/fstop and listen to join. Thank you for your support. Cheers. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.